Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, guys, for Chapter 10, Key Issues 3 and 4. Today, we're going to be talking about why do countries face development challenges, right? We already got into the idea of development itself. And the other idea that we're going to look at is why are countries able to make progress in that development? All right, so we're getting into all of the issues that go along with development, especially in those places that we're still looking at, developing nations. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. So if we talk about how LDCs or lesser developed countries or developing countries can eventually become more developed countries or fully developed countries, there are kind of two big obstacles that we see. Number one is they have to implement some kind of policy that is going to help them promote growth over time. All right. Number two is they need to also locate the money that they can find to actually help them financially develop. And so developing countries tend to adopt one of two policies. Now, today, most countries are going to adopt the international trade approach. All right. But for the sake of looking at these two options, there's also an option called the self-sufficiency approach. Right now, we don't see many countries today that look at themselves as we want to be self-sufficient. It's just not possible very much anymore in a globalized economy. But there are two methods that we can use. So self-sufficiency approach, international trade approach. All right, so we're going to go a little bit more in depth on both of these right now. When we look at the self-sufficiency approach, the idea of this is it's there to promote balanced growth. All right, the investment is spread out equally through the entire economic sectors or all the sectors and equally around the entire country. All right, government is going to control the utilities, so things like power, water, right, the electricity, things like that, right. They're going to control those utilities, and then the policies that they put in place are there to protect the local businesses. And so they'll put in protection like import limits. They'll limit the amount of goods that can be imported to their country by putting tariffs or taxes on them or quotas on the amount that can come in. They'll do something called insulation, where businesses are basically isolated from the more developed countries' businesses. All right, so they don't allow a lot of the international business to happen in their country. They'll give equal investment, which means, again, like we said up before, they'll spread money out equally across the entire country, and so all economic sectors, the entire country, then is equally divided up. And then we also see the equal income, meaning equal in urban areas versus rural areas. So the goal of trying to equalize both of those out is to reduce the poverty that we tend to see in rural areas as well. All right, and urban areas, depending on what country you're talking about. And so a little bit more in depth here, guys, with the self-sufficiency approach. One of the best case studies of this was India. Now, this is a historical approach because we don't see in that today. India has become globalized as well. But if we look at India at one point did try the self-sufficiency approach. And the idea was that two major problems came up. Number one, unproductive businesses in the country of India were protected. And so if you have a business that's unproductive, with the government controlling prices, with them not really allowing foreign competition in, that doesn't give those businesses a whole lot of incentive to get better, whether it is to increase their quality or reduce the costs or whatever it may be. It did not give any incentive for those countries to try harder to become better. The other thing that we see is that with all this organization that was put in place to stop a lot of the or give a lot of the protections, I should say, to those companies in India, we saw a large potential for abuse of power and corruption. And so the government and a lot of the bureaucracy that was created became corrupted. And that led to heavy resources being dedicated to trying to enforce those policies, which, again, isn't probably the most productive way to deal with things. All right, so that's your self-sufficiency approach. So here's India as your case study. So you can see what they were like during their self-sufficiency years, and then that dotted line there, right around 1991 or 92, that's when they all of a sudden take off, and that's where they begin the international trade approach. And you can see that they were much more successful as an international trade approach country, right? Again, that globalized economy makes it very difficult for you to remain self-sufficient at this point. So we look at the international trade approach. Countries tend to focus on just specific resources so that they have an advantage and they can promote growth in their country based on those advantages. And there is a model that goes along with it. You guys need to know this model, Rostow's model of development. And there are 5 stages to Rostow's model. The first is basically countries go through these 5 stages. The first is the traditional society. All right, from traditional society, we see that you have kind of a primary sector economy, fairly low income. So you're focusing on farming, mining, right? Things like that, fishing. When you get into the preconditions for takeoff, now you're starting to invest more in technology, starting to build the infrastructure for the country to become more developed. You reach takeoff, which is now where you see this rapid growth of kind of niche industries. And so we're seeing more manufacturing, more industrialization. We get to level 4 here, and you see a drive to maturity. And that is where we have kind of increased income promoting growth in other sectors, not just in the industrial sector now. And workers start becoming more and more skilled. And then we get to 5, where the more developed countries tend to locate themselves here on this stage here. We look at the age of mass consumption. So you're shifting now toward all of manufacturing of consumer goods and high-tech products. All right. This is also known as the modernization model. It's sometimes called the ladder of development. But the idea is this is Rostow's model of development in general. So you need to know Rostow. You need to know about the 5 stages here. All right. So what benefits do countries gain from being self-sufficient versus being more of the international trade, right? International trade increased a lot more rapidly during the late 20th century and the early 21st century. And so with that, the wealth started to increase as well. But countries benefited in 3 ways here. All right. So we look at that. Other countries were successful. They kind of followed the blueprint of other successful countries as they were going through this. Right. Like I said, India, as they were trying to develop into becoming more developed, they started to look at ways that they could become more competitive internationally. They looked for resources that were rich, right? They were rich in specific resources. So those developing countries have a lot of raw materials. They need to focus on kind of promoting and focusing on one specific material that can help set themselves apart on the international scale. All right, and then we look at the international competitiveness, and obviously those countries are then exposed to the international community and globalization. And so we talk about the demands and the needs of consumers all across the world, not just in their country. And so we see a lot of this can alter the market to those new demands. And so that's going to then change those countries. They need to look for that competitive advantage that they may have for their country on the global scale. All right, so we look at the benefits of self-sufficiency moving toward international here. We look at some of the examples of international trade approach here. 2 big countries, or 2 big organizations, I should say, the old dragons, or the old tigers, depending on which one you look at. But Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, they all kind of worked together, and they were funding support from the United States and United Kingdom after World War II, and that helped them gain a competitive advantage. And they were able to very quickly motivate and push their development levels higher and higher by focusing on education and skilled labor. And so we saw a lot of education going on for their workers. We saw working on specific skills and labor that they could focus on for their economies. And that's what made them important and larger in the international or globalization idea here. Today, we have the new Asian dragons, or the new Asian tigers. They don't mention them in the book, but we have China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. They are also doing the same thing. Their funding is coming a lot of times from private corporations and private investors. But they're focusing, instead of on the skilled labor and the education, they're actually focusing on cheap labor as a resource. So if you check, a lot of things like your clothing, shoes, clothing, other items like that, they actually come from these new Asian dragon countries, because they have very cheap labor. The cheaper the labor, the easier it is for you to lower the prices of products. All right, and so that's what we see here. And so if we talk about some of the problems that go along with international trade, is it does create some issues for countries. Number one, you're relying typically on a single resource or a single commodity for your country. And that's because you're looking for that comparative or that competitive advantage over other countries. And so if global price and demands change or fluctuate for that item or that resource, it could be profitable, or it could end up being not profitable. And so that can definitely affect the economy of a country. Right, countries that have focused on maybe tourism, they're probably hurting quite a bit over the last year, right? With less travel going on. We look at increasing dependence on more developed countries. And so we talk about this, the lack of industry in these developing nations. If they're focusing on this international trade, they're going to have to rely on imports from more developed countries in order to get some of the basic materials they need if they're focusing on specific resources and goods that they can sell internationally. And so the income then is spent on a lot of the high cost foreign goods coming in. The other issue we see here is effects in the long term here of the changes in the global market. If the global market is down, if things happen in China that could affect another country, that's going to cause the market in that other country to decline as well. So market decline is an issue. We also talk about foreign competition. Is it easy for these lesser developed nations to compete with large corporations or large scale production in, say, the United States? And no, right? That's much more difficult for them to compete on a larger scale, right? Instead of a large fish in a small pond, now you're a small fish in a large pond, right? Lots of different competition now enabled because of that. So if we talk about which approach is more widely used today, there really aren't a lot of countries that use the self-sufficiency approach. The best one that comes to mind is the North Korea, right? And we know how successful North Korea has been, right? Not very successful when we look at their economy or much of their country at this point. Most countries today do have some kind of international trade program that they work with. The globalized economy has made it very difficult for you to remain self-sufficient. And so there's a lot of research as well that shows that the international trade approach is much better for your economy, much better for your country in general. And so when we talk about international trade and trying to promote trade itself, there's a couple of organizations that help do that. The WTO and the FDI are there to help promote international trade. So the World Trade Organization is there to try to eliminate trade barriers between countries. And they do try to enforce the trade agreements and the protection that has been put in place for the right of the workers there in those countries. But they have been criticized because a lot of people think that the WTO largely ignores poor countries. They kind of threaten some of the state sovereignty of those poorer nations, and a lot of people believe that they help to destroy the environment. All right. When we look at the foreign direct investment, the FDI here, this is investment by usually transnational companies into a foreign economy. And so we talk about large corporations coming from like more developed countries. They will send money into lesser developed countries to help them develop. And so we talk about only about 33% of all the foreign direct investment in the world actually goes to these lesser developed countries. 33% of all the lesser developed countries FDI actually goes to one nation specifically. So out of all that, of the 100% of that 33, right, over a third of it goes just to China, and only 10% of it goes to the entire continent of Africa. All right, so this gives you an idea of how kind of unfair or unequal the amount of money is going from like versus one country to 60 countries, right? So over half of all of this, we look at the transnational corporations are United States or European countries. So those companies are investing in China. They're investing in some African nations. But again, it's not equal when we look at it. That's a really poor picture, but some graphics there of some people protesting the WTO. Basically, whenever the WTO holds like a meeting, there are lots of protesters there. A lot of people that are very much against the World Trade Organization. Here's your growth in foreign direct investment. So you can see a lot more growth happening in Latin America, East Asia. Like you said, a lot of it going into East Asia. And you can see all the rest of the world then is the gray line there. All right, all the other developing regions. So that includes the rest of Asia. That includes the rest of Africa, everything there. Here's the sources and destination. So you can see the sources of the FDI, a lot of it coming from North America and Europe. And you can see the destinations. A lot of it going to Europe and North America, and then the rest of it, less than 50%, going to the rest of the world from there. So yes, foreign companies do invest in other parts of the world, but a lot of times it doesn't mean they're investing in the poorer parts of the world, and that's some of the issues that we see. Here's the foreign direct investment flows here. So you can see a lot of it leaving Europe and going to those places there. A lot of it going to Brazil, right? A lot of it going to China as well, India, Turkey, Egypt, kind of the big ones, Mexico. Excuse me. And then you can see kind of the Americans, where our foreign direct investments going. A lot of it going to China, a lot of it going to South Korea, right? And so that's kind of the big idea of other countries here. So we talk about how do LDCs find funding for development. So if they're not getting funding from these large corporations, where are they getting money from? And there are a couple of options. We have the World Bank loans, and these are typically used for like government programs. So there is a World Bank, and they're able to fund government programs, develop the financial institutions that they need to help create these projects. So they have to go into some kind of like infrastructure for the country. So the money is provided for like the sale of bonds for the government so that they can work on helping to build up the financial institutions or transportation projects, basically. The International Monetary Fund is another way that lesser developed countries can find funding. And this is used to help kind of in-debt nations stabilize their economy. So this has to go into legitimately just into the economy. It's not for specific projects like the WBL, all right, but it's going into stabilize the economy so that they don't fail, so that the country doesn't collapse on itself. All right, so that's the IMF. Again, both organizations have faced scrutiny, but they also are attempting to do good things as well. There's your World Bank loans from in the year 2017, so you can see where a lot of those were going. All right. And then we talk about microfinance, and we'll talk a little bit more about microfinance as we get going. But microfinance is basically an alternative way for people to get like small business loans in these developing countries. And one of them that's really famous is the Grameen Bank. The Grameen Bank was established in 1977 in Bangladesh, and it specialized in making loans to women in order to help them develop a little business and sell like their handicrafts or their crafts that they make, and to get money. And so only about 1% of the loans have ever been failed to be paid back. So they're just loaning the money. It's basically like this bank loans, in this case, these women money, and then over time they'll pay it back. So it might be so that they can buy a sewing machine, or it might be so that they can buy material or whatever it might be, and then they pay that back. And so the average cost of these loans is only $60. All right, and so that's where microfinance comes from. They're giving this money that is going to eventually be paid back, but it's also allowing these women to find a way to make ends meet and kind of make a living for themselves. All they need is this small little boost of money, and now they're able to continue to finance themselves after they start making money on their products. Okay. We also have something called Kiva, and we're going to watch a little video clip about Kiva, all right? Or we may already have, but we'll talk a little bit more about Kiva. Same kind of thing, only this is like people kind of like crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, and it's like more developed nations can crowdsource or crowdfund like a farmer in Argentina if he needs like a tractor or something, all right? So it's very similar to the microfinance we just talked about there. Lastly, guys, we look at, or getting into the end here, we look at some of the funding problems that have come up here, some of the funding programs, I should say, and how they've actually worked. And some of them have led to issues. And so we look at the goals of most LDC loans is to improve the infrastructure or to bring business in. The problem with that is they have to eventually repay those loans. So if those are loaned money or are lent money, and then they're not able to attract the business or build the infrastructure they need to make themselves better, then that leads to issues for them being able to repay that loan. And so many development programs have failed because of this versus faulty engineering. It could be the funds are stolen or squandered because of corruption in that country, new businesses not being attracted to that country after they've gotten a loan. A lot of LDCs, like I said, they just can't afford to repay those loans. And so that's an issue that has become a big problem when we talk about trying to help these developing nations to develop faster. If they're not able to make the money back and pay those loans back, then it's just putting them further and further in debt. And you can see here's LDC debt if you look around the world. So obviously the purple is the developed countries already. So the other ones are the countries where we see the darkest are 35% or higher debt. And so that's their debt as their percentage of their gross national income. And so lots of debt. You can see, even in Europe, there are Eastern European countries that have a lot of debt, and it's very difficult for them to get out of debt and then develop their nation more. So some of the past indicators that we've looked at here when we talk about progress, and developing countries typically talk about like HDI, right? The Human Development Index. We also look at the gross national income per capita, or education, or life expectancy. They all measure basically the progress that's being made in those countries. And this, you can kind of see it from this map here. Those areas that are making better progress, or those areas that are already more developed versus those developing areas. All right, so you can see, where do we see most of the low development? And that's sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been talking about that all class, right? We've talked about the idea of some of the issues that have gone along with that population obviously being an issue, and some of the political issues there, and religious issues there, and all the other problems that we see. One thing that the United Nations has done is they have developed goals that they've called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so they've changed over time. The United Nations, we know the members have agreed to this, and they're trying to achieve these goals by the year 2030. And these goals were originally called the 8 United Nations Millennium Goals, and they set those in 2015. But they've updated them, and they've pushed the timeline out to 2030 now. And so you can see, basically, it's to end poverty, to end hunger, right? Reducing equality. And the idea is to make the world a better place. And so the United Nations is trying to make things better in general, right? I would just make sure you know a little bit about the UN Sustainability Development Goals here. Finally, guys, we get into the fair trade approach, and this is one way that we can help to make development better in a nation. Products are made and traded according to what the standards are there in these lesser developed countries to protect the workers and the businesses. And so standards are set, and we look at those standards being set basically by the fair trade ideas here. And we talk about the establishment of cooperatives, so having farmers work together, making sure that they're being paid fair wages, making sure that the safety is being taken care of, and then they reinvest the money into those local communities. And so a lot of things that you might see as fair trade, they a lot of times have a logo on them, are crafts and products like that. Coffee beans, cocoa beans, bananas, a lot of times are fair trade. And when I talk about fair trade, I mean like literally making sure that they're getting paid 59 cents a barrel or a bushel instead of 50 cents. That's what we're talking about. And so, yes, like if you buy fair trade coffee, it's slightly more expensive in our stores, but you're making sure that that money is actually going to the farmers and they're getting the amount that they're supposed to have. That corporations aren't coming in and say, we're going to give you 49 cents for those cocoa beans instead of 59 cents. Because that's their livelihood. And 10 cents per barrel or bushel or whatever you want to measure it out as, that ultimately comes back and hurts them in the long run. And that makes it so that this system, this fair trade system, makes it so they can make a living, all right, and they can afford the things that they need to afford. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That kind of wraps up chapter 10 here. So we will see you again soon. If you have any questions, make sure you get a hold of Mr. Starr or Mr. Sheridan. Take it easy.